She said she shouldn't let me in, but when the door opened, it wasn't just her house that felt warm, it was her heart trying to remember how to trust again. The rain had just stopped when he arrived at her doorstep, that quiet moment after a storm when everything feels washed clean but uncertain. The street was slick, the air smelled of wet earth and pine, and the house stood there, a soft glow spilling from its front windows. He hesitated before knocking. It wasn't his place to be here, not really. She was his neighbor, someone he'd only waved to a few times while mowing the lawn or bringing in the mail. But that evening, she had looked lonely. Standing in her yard, staring at the sky like she was waiting for something, or someone, to remind her she wasn't invisible. When she opened the door, her expression carried both surprise and a quiet caution. She was a 40-year-old woman, elegant even in her simplicity, dark hair pulled loosely back, sleeves rolled up, a soft cardigan draped over her shoulders. There was grace in the way she held herself, and a kind of tired beauty in her eyes, like she'd been strong for too long. Her lips parted slightly, as if to say something, but instead, she just exhaled and leaned against the doorframe. "I shouldn't let you in," she said finally, her tone halfway between teasing and protecting herself. Her voice wasn't harsh. It was low, steady, like she was reminding herself of the boundaries she'd built since her divorce. Boundaries meant to keep her safe. To keep people out. He smiled lightly, not pushing, not pleading. Just waiting. The silence between them stretched, not awkward, but waited. Rain dripped from the edges of the roof, the smell of coffee floated faintly from inside, and the air between them hummed with something unspoken. Then she stepped back. A small gesture. A quiet surrender. The living room was warm and softly lit. A single lamp on the side table, half-empty wine glass on the counter, a book turned face down on the couch. Her world felt lived in but lonely, like she had created comfort around herself and yet never really settled into it. He noticed the little things, a framed picture turned slightly away, a pile of mail unopened, a pair of slippers tucked neatly under the chair. She busied herself making tea, avoiding his eyes. He could tell she wasn't used to having someone there, someone who noticed, someone who listened. He thanked her for the tea, and when she finally met his gaze again, it wasn't guarded anymore. It was curious. Vulnerable. They talked about small things, the neighborhood, the weather, the stubborn fence between their yards. But beneath the light conversation, something deeper stirred. It wasn't attraction, not yet. It was recognition, two people quietly aware of the emptiness in the other, pretending it wasn't there. When he stood to leave, she walked him to the door. Her hand brushed his briefly, accidental, warm, and a little too long to be just polite. "Good night," she said softly. And though she closed the door, he knew, this wasn't the last time it would open. The days that followed carried an odd rhythm, one of silent curiosity and restrained awareness. Every time he passed by her house, he caught glimpses of her through the window, arranging flowers, folding laundry, sometimes just standing there, lost in thought. It wasn't intentional watching, it was more like gravity, pulling him towards something familiar yet forbidden. She was different now, or maybe he was finally seeing her clearly. The same 40-year-old divorced woman with long black hair that framed her lightly tanned skin and subtle freckles. Her beauty wasn't loud, it was lived in, softened by experience, deepened by quiet confidence. She had a way of moving, graceful, deliberate, as though she knew the world was watching but didn't care to perform for it anymore. One Saturday afternoon, as he was working on his car in the driveway, she walked over. Her hair was tied in a loose bun, a few strands falling over her cheek, and she wore a pale blue sundress that swayed just enough to catch the light breeze. Her tone was casual, but her eyes, dark brown and searching, carried something deeper. "I was making dinner," she said, brushing a stray hair behind her ear. "There's too much for one person." He froze for a second. It wasn't just an invitation, it was a risk. A crack in the invisible wall she'd built since the night she said, "I shouldn't let you in." He accepted, not out of politeness but something instinctive, a pull he couldn't quite name. Her home looked warmer that evening. Soft music played from an old speaker, the scent of roasted garlic and herbs filled the air, and candles flickered gently on the table. She had changed out of her sundress into a simple white blouse and jeans, casual but effortlessly elegant. When she smiled at him as he stepped inside, it wasn't the guarded smile from before. It was lighter, almost shy. Dinner was simple: pasta, salad, a bottle of red wine she claimed she'd opened for no reason at all. Their conversation flowed easily, skipping between laughter and quiet pauses. He learned about her, not just her favorite books or the job she once loved, but the tiny things: her dislike for cold mornings, how she always kept a candle burning at night, and how she hadn't had company for dinner in over a year. When their fingers brushed as they reached for the same bottle of wine, neither pulled away immediately. There was a pause, that small, electric silence where everything you don't say becomes louder than what you do. He looked at her then, really looked, the faint smile lines near her eyes, the warmth in her gaze that betrayed the loneliness beneath. She broke the silence first, her voice soft but steady. "You make this house feel alive again." The words hung between them, tender and fragile. And though they both looked away, they didn't need to speak what they already knew: something had shifted. The line they'd been tiptoeing around had quietly disappeared. The rain began that evening without warning, soft at first, then relentless, soaking the quiet neighborhood in a gray hush. He hadn't meant to stop by her house. He told himself he was just checking if she was okay. Her car hadn't been moved all day, and the storm was getting worse. But when he saw the faint glow from her living room window, something inside him pulled forward. He hesitated at her door, water dripping from his hair, his heart beating faster than it should have. For a moment, he thought about turning back, about the whispers, the judgment, the invisible lines of age and circumstance that everyone said shouldn't be crossed. But before he could decide, the door opened. She stood there barefoot, her long black hair damp at the ends, wearing an oversized gray sweater that hung loosely off one shoulder. Candlelight flickered behind her, painting her lightly tanned skin in a soft, golden warmth. There was a surprised look on her face, not startled, just quietly moved that he'd come. "You'll catch a cold," she said, her voice almost a whisper. She stepped aside. "Come in." He crossed the threshold, careful not to leave muddy footprints on her wooden floor. The scent of vanilla and rain filled the room. She handed him a towel, their fingers brushing briefly, a fleeting contact that carried the same charged stillness as their dinner days before. "I wasn't expecting company," she said, smiling faintly as she poured him a mug of tea. "But I guess I shouldn't be surprised anymore." They sat together on the couch, the rain tapping against the windows like a quiet metronome. He watched as she curled up beside him, her knees tucked under the sweater, her posture relaxed but her eyes thoughtful. "I used to love nights like this," she said softly. "When I was married, we'd just sit, listen to the rain, talk about nothing." There was no bitterness in her voice, just a soft ache, the kind that comes from remembering something gentle that ended too soon. He nodded, unsure what to say, afraid that words might break the fragile peace between them. Instead, he placed his hand on the couch beside her, close, but not touching. She noticed, and after a moment's hesitation, her hand found his. Her skin was warm against his damp fingers. They didn't look at each other right away. The connection was quiet, unspoken, two lives brushing against each other in the space between loneliness and comfort. When she finally turned her head, their eyes met. For a second, the air felt still. "People will talk," she murmured, a sad smile touching her lips. "Let them," he replied quietly. The sound of thunder rolled in the distance. She leaned back slightly, studying him, her expression unreadable, somewhere between fear and longing. The rain softened outside, but inside, something else had begun to stir. Neither of them said another word. The silence, heavy with unspoken emotion, said enough. The next morning felt heavier than usual. The rain had passed, leaving the streets slick and quiet, but inside him, the storm still lingered. Every memory of the night before, her hand resting near his, her quiet smile, the flicker of candlelight on her face, replayed like scenes from a dream he wasn't ready to wake from. He hadn't planned to see her again so soon, but something inside him, curiosity, concern, maybe longing, drew him back. The air was crisp as he walked the familiar path to her front door. This time, she opened it before he could even knock. She was dressed simply in a soft beige cardigan over a white blouse, her long black hair falling loose over her shoulders. There were faint traces of sleeplessness around her eyes, but when she saw him, a small smile appeared, one that looked both relieved and uncertain. "I thought I'd scared you off," she said, her voice carrying a warmth that instantly disarmed him. He shook his head lightly. "No. You couldn't." She laughed under her breath, then stepped aside to let him in. The scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. On the table, 2 mugs sat waiting, steam curling into the morning light that spilled through the window. They sat across from each other, the silence not awkward but weighted, like both were waiting for the other to speak first. She toyed with the edge of her mug, her fingers brushing the ceramic rim again and again, a nervous rhythm that betrayed the calmness of her tone when she finally spoke. "I keep telling myself to be careful," she said. "That this shouldn't feel like it does." He looked up, meeting her gaze. "And how does it feel?" She hesitated, just long enough for him to see the battle behind her eyes. Then she exhaled softly, her shoulders relaxing as if surrendering to truth. "Alive," she whispered. "It feels alive." The words hit him harder than he expected. There was no flirtation in her voice, no pretense, just honesty, raw and fragile. He leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the table. "You deserve to feel that." Her lips parted as if to reply, but no sound came. Instead, she looked away toward the window, blinking against the brightness outside. A bird perched on the sill, chirping faintly, the world, indifferent yet quietly in tune with the confession that now hung between them. "You're too young to understand what it's like," she said softly, still staring out the window. "To build a life, lose it, and then try to pretend you're fine." "I understand more than you think," he said gently. "And I don't see you as broken." That made her look back at him, eyes glistening, lips trembling between gratitude and fear. For a long moment, neither moved. The sunlight caught her features, the soft laugh lines, the graceful poise, the quiet sadness that gave her beauty depth. Then, without another word, she reached across the table and placed her hand over his. It wasn't a romantic gesture, not exactly. It was something deeper. A silent admission that two people, despite everything, had found a piece of understanding in each other. And for the first time, she didn't pull away. The days that followed her confession moved slowly, each one tinged with a strange, quiet ache. They both seemed to drift into a rhythm of avoidance, not from anger or regret, but from fear. Fear of what they were becoming to each other. Fear of how natural it had started to feel. He would catch glimpses of her, watering her plants on the porch in the early morning light, her long black hair tied back loosely, sunlight catching the strands. Sometimes she'd look up, almost as if expecting to see him, but the moment their eyes met, she'd glance away, pretending to be busy. He understood. What had been shared over coffee that morning wasn't just honesty, it was vulnerability laid bare. And she wasn't used to being seen that clearly anymore. A week passed before they spoke again. It was late afternoon when he found her sitting on the front steps of her house, a cup of tea balanced between her palms. She looked tired, not in the physical sense, but as though she'd been carrying the weight of too many thoughts. He hesitated before walking closer. "You've been quiet," he said softly. She looked up, her expression unreadable. "I needed to be." He sat beside her, close enough to feel the warmth of her shoulder but not close enough to touch. For a moment, they just listened to the faint hum of cicadas, the distant laughter of children playing down the street. "I don't want to make things harder for you," he finally said. Her lips curved into a faint, wistful smile. "You already have," she replied, her tone gentle, not accusatory. Then, after a pause, but not in a bad way. The honesty of it caught him off guard. I spent years building walls, she continued, her eyes on the fading light. And now, you just walk right through them. And I don't know what to do with that. He turned slightly, studying her face, the delicate lines near her eyes, the faint freckles across her nose, the quiet strength in her posture. She wasn't fragile. She was simply real, a woman who had loved, lost, and learned to live without expecting warmth. You don't have to do anything, he said softly. You just have to let yourself feel again. Her eyes flickered toward him, searching his expression. That's easy for you to say. He smiled faintly. Not really. It scares me too. That made her laugh quietly, the sound small, but genuine. They sat in silence for a while after that, watching the sunset melt into the horizon. The air between them felt both peaceful and charged, like something unspoken had been quietly understood. But when he finally stood to leave, she didn't stop him. Instead, she whispered, almost to herself, I need to learn to miss you a little, before I can really want you here. He nodded, understanding more than words could say. As he walked away, he could still feel her gaze on him, soft, uncertain, and full of the same question that neither of them dared to answer yet. The days turned into weeks, and distance became a strange kind of silence between them. He tried to lose himself in routine, work, errands, empty distractions, but everything carried a trace of her. The scent of rain on pavement reminded him of that night. The flicker of a candle brought back her living room, her soft laughter. Even the quiet of his own home felt louder now, echoing with the absence of her voice. Then one evening, as he pulled into the driveway after a long day, he noticed her porch light glowing faintly. The window curtains were drawn, but the silhouette of someone moving inside caught his eye. He stood there for a moment, heart tugging against his hesitation. He wasn't sure if she wanted to see him, but sometimes, silence needed breaking. He walked up to her door, pausing just before he knocked. The same door where she once said, I shouldn't let you in. This time, he could almost hear those words again, softer, almost inviting. Before he could knock, the door opened. She stood there, framed by warm lamplight, wearing a simple cream sweater and jeans. Her long black hair fell loose down her back, her lightly tanned skin glowing faintly in the evening light. For a moment, neither spoke. Her dark brown eyes searched his face, cautious at first, then slowly softening. I was wondering when you'd come back, she said, voice barely above a whisper. He smiled gently. I wasn't sure if I should. Neither was I, she admitted, stepping aside. But here you are. Inside, everything looked the same, but something felt different. Maybe it was her. Maybe it was both of them. The air was warmer, not tense but fragile, like something new was forming in the quiet. They sat together at the table again, though this time, there was no pretense of small talk. Just the steady hum of their own thoughts. She stirred her tea absent-mindedly, her fingers tracing the edge of the cup. I tried to forget how it felt, she said finally, eyes still downcast. That night. When it was easy. When I didn't care what anyone thought. He leaned forward slightly. You don't have to forget it. She looked up then, and for the first time, he saw tears gathering at the edges of her eyes. Not from sadness, but release. I was afraid that if I let you close again, I'd start to hope, she said quietly. And I've spent years trying not to hope for anything. He reached across the table, his hand brushing hers. The contact was gentle, reverent, like asking permission without words. She didn't pull away this time. You don't have to hope alone, he said. A long silence followed, but it was a different kind of silence now. One filled with possibility instead of fear. When she finally smiled, it was small and trembling, but real. You're stubborn, she whispered. He smiled back. Only about the things that matter. Outside, the night had deepened, but inside, everything felt brighter. The space between them, once careful, uncertain, now carried something unmistakable, warmth, and the quiet beginning of something neither could deny anymore. Morning sunlight spilled gently through her kitchen window, painting soft gold across the walls. The air smelled faintly of coffee and rain-soaked grass from the night before. Everything about that morning felt still, like the world had finally taken a deep breath and decided to rest. He sat at her table again, the same place where so many conversations had changed the rhythm of their lives. But today felt different. There was no hesitation in the air, no distance stretching between them. She moved around the kitchen quietly, graceful as always, long black hair tied loosely, wearing a soft white blouse and faded blue jeans. The simplicity suited her, emphasizing the calm assurance that had begun to replace her old uncertainty. When she finally turned toward him with a mug of coffee, he noticed the quiet ease in her expression. The guarded smile she once wore had softened into something more open, something real. "You're up early," she said lightly. He smiled. "Didn't sleep much." She set the mug down in front of him and leaned against the counter, folding her arms. "Too much on your mind?" He nodded slightly, his voice low. "Mostly you." Her lips curved in a small, knowing smile, but she didn't look away. "You really don't make this easy." He chuckled softly. "You don't make it easy to walk away." That made her pause, just long enough for him to see the flicker of emotion behind her calm. She took a slow breath and crossed the room to sit beside him. For a moment, neither spoke. The sound of a clock ticking faintly in the background filled the quiet space between them. "When you first came here," she said softly, "I thought you were just being kind. I told myself you'd get bored, that you'd move on. I didn't think," she trailed off, searching for the right words. "I didn't think I'd start looking forward to hearing your footsteps outside my door." He met her gaze, his voice steady but tender. "You don't have to explain." Her hand rested on the table, inches from his. The morning light caught the faint lines near her eyes, the ones that told stories of laughter, heartbreak, and years she thought had made her too old to feel this way again. "I spent so long being someone's wife," she said, her tone trembling slightly. "Then I spent even longer trying to be no one's anything. I forgot what it felt like to just be seen." He reached out, his fingers brushing the back of her hand. "You were never invisible." Her breath caught, and for a heartbeat, she didn't move. Then she turned her hand, letting their fingers intertwine. It wasn't dramatic, no sudden kiss, no declarations. Just two people sitting in a quiet kitchen, the morning sun bathing them in warmth that felt like understanding. She looked at him then, eyes soft and steady. "You make me believe it's okay to start again." He smiled faintly, voice low. "Maybe it's not about starting over. Maybe it's just about continuing, with someone who sees you." Her eyes shimmered, and for the first time in years, she didn't look afraid. Outside, the world carried on, cars passing, wind in the trees, a new day unfolding. But inside that small kitchen, time seemed to pause, holding them in a fragile, perfect stillness. The line she once drew between them was gone. And in its place stood something gentler, stronger, not a promise, but a quiet acceptance that love, even when unexpected, could still find its way home.